Burkina Faso was never supposed to have this kind of power. That's what the West kept drilling into our minds. For 70 years, they dug uranium from our soil, shipped it to Paris, London, Washington, and lit up their cities while our children studied by candlelight. They called us developing. They said we were too poor, too unstable, too dangerous for nuclear energy. But on the day I placed that uranium sample on the table beside Prime Minister Modi, everything changed. The silence in that room was not respect. It was fear, the kind of fear that rises when empires feel the foundations beneath them start to crack. $56 billion, 4 reactors, each strong enough to power an entire nation, uranium fuel processing plants, nuclear universities training thousands of African scientists, research centers, safety systems, waste facilities, transmission lines reaching every forgotten village. This is not aid. This is not charity. This is atomic sovereignty. For the first time in history, uranium mined on African soil will not be shipped abroad. It will be burned in African reactors, generating African electricity at African prices. Do you understand what that means? It means the monopoly is over. The nuclear club of America, France, Britain, and Russia is broken. It means the raw material that made the West rich will now make Africa powerful. And that is why the phones in Paris and Washington rang, not with congratulations, but with threats. Because if Burkina Faso, one of the smallest and poorest nations on Earth, can break through the nuclear barrier, then the entire world order is at risk of collapse. So, I ask you directly, if Burkina Faso can seize the atom, who will be next? And when the first African reactor roars to life, will that sound be electricity or the death rattle of Western supremacy? If you want to keep hearing shocking truths, the hidden stories the mainstream will never tell, hit subscribe right now and turn on notifications, because in the next part, you'll see why this deal does not just change Burkina Faso, it shakes the United States itself. $56 billion that made Paris tremble. The deal was not just paperwork, it was a weapon against the old order that kept Africa shackled for 70 years. When Prime Minister Modi sat down with Burkina Faso's leadership to sign the $56 billion nuclear agreement, the ink on that paper struck harder than any bullet ever fired in the Sahel. This was not development aid. This was not a charity program dressed in diplomatic words. This was Africa's atomic declaration of independence. At the heart of the deal were 4 next-generation nuclear reactors, each designed to generate 1,200 megawatts of electricity, together producing more power than Burkina Faso's entire existing grid. For decades, the country survived on intermittent power, diesel generators, and broken promises. One signature changed that forever. These reactors will provide reliable electricity for millions of homes, factories, and hospitals, shifting Burkina Faso from an energy beggar to an energy exporter. But reactors were only the beginning. The agreement included $15 billion for uranium fuel processing, the game changer. For 70 years, African uranium was dug out of the ground and shipped raw to France, Britain, and the United States, where it was refined and turned into nuclear fuel. Africa's soil provided the raw material, but Africa's people remained in the dark. Now, for the first time, the fuel cycle will be completed inside Africa. Traoré mined in Burkina Faso will be processed in Burkina Faso, enriched in Burkina Faso, fabricated in Burkina Faso, and finally burned in Burkina Faso's own reactors. The deal also committed $8 billion to nuclear universities and training programs. Over the next 15 years, India will train 10,000 African nuclear engineers. Think about what that means. Not just lights in villages, not just machines in hospitals, but the birth of a scientific class, African physicists, African material scientists, African engineers mastering technology the West once claimed was too advanced for Africa. Knowledge once guarded in Western laboratories will now flow through African classrooms. That alone is enough to terrify the global order. Add to this $6 billion for nuclear safety and waste management, ensuring facilities meet and exceed international standards. No shortcuts, no second-rate infrastructure. Africa's nuclear plants will not only function, they will prove the world wrong by setting a global example of safety and efficiency. Then came $4 billion for transmission infrastructure, delivering nuclear power to rural villages long abandoned by diesel grids and foreign aid projects. For the first time in history, entire provinces will have electricity 24 hours a day, every day. To complete the picture, the deal set aside $2 billion for research facilities and $1 billion for regulatory frameworks, not just reactors, but a whole ecosystem. Laboratories, inspectors, independent regulators, all designed to ensure that Africa's nuclear future is not just powerful, but permanent. This was not a piecemeal project. This was a system, a complete nuclear state built from the ground up, and the symbolism was impossible to ignore. For decades, Africans were told to be grateful for solar panels that died with the clouds or diesel plants that broke after a month. Now, they were building infrastructure so advanced it had only ever existed in 31 nations before. It was a direct slap in the face to the arrogance of the old world order. The moment this deal was announced, phones rang across Paris, Brussels, and Washington, not with congratulations, but with panic. France in particular saw its decades-long grip on African uranium collapse in an instant. No more cheap ore fueling French reactors while African villages went dark. No more monopoly. The same resource that had lit up Europe for generations would now light up Africa itself. And for the old empires, that was more dangerous than any revolution. This was not just about power plants. It was about power itself. Who controls it, who distributes it, and who profits from it. And in that single moment, control slipped from Western capitals and moved, shockingly, into African hands. When the West panicked overnight, the announcement of the $56 billion nuclear deal spread across the world faster than wildfire. Within hours, Paris went into emergency meetings. Washington called its embassies in the Sahel. Ottawa drafted statements that never made it to the press. This was not normal diplomacy. This was panic. For France, the shock was existential. For decades, French companies controlled uranium mines in Niger, Mali, and Burkina Faso. Cheap African ore fueled French reactors, keeping the lights of Paris glowing bright. That system collapsed in a single press conference. French officials raged that Africans could not be trusted with nuclear technology. Behind closed doors, they revived colonial language, calling Africans unstable, reckless, incapable. But the truth was simpler. France was watching its last grip on African energy slip away. In Washington, the panic was more subtle, but no less desperate. Pentagon officials suddenly raised proliferation concerns. The State Department warned of regional instability. They proposed alternatives: solar farms, wind turbines, gas pipelines, anything but nuclear. But none of these alternatives frighten Washington as much as a single truth. Nuclear power brings respect. Nuclear power brings sovereignty. And a sovereign Africa is something the old order cannot control. Meanwhile, on the streets of Ouagadougou, the reaction was the opposite. Crowds filled the city with chants. No more darkness. No more dependence. Flags of Burkina Faso waved beside banners of India. For the first time in living memory, the people felt not just hope, but power. A mechanic in Gawa told a reporter, "This deal means I can keep my shop open 24 hours. It means jobs for my sons." In Kaya Hospital, doctors celebrated, "No more surgeries by flashlight. We will have power like Paris." But with every cheer came new dangers. Intelligence sources reported whispers of coup plots. Propaganda campaigns spread across social media, sowing doubts about safety and corruption. Mysterious articles appeared in Western newspapers warning of a new African Chernobyl. These were not coincidences. They were weapons, tools to destabilize, to divide, to crush momentum before it could spread across the continent. And yet, the more they attacked, the stronger the message became. For 70 years, Africa's uranium fueled the rise of others. Now, it was fueling its own future. Every accusation, every threat only confirmed one truth. The world order was changing, and Africa was no longer asking for permission. The climax was clear. What started as a signature in a quiet room had become a battle of narratives across the globe. On one side, Western leaders trembling at the thought of a nuclear-powered Africa. On the other, millions of Africans shouting that they would never return to the darkness. The question now is simple. Who will win? And here is where you, the listener, come in. Because these are the stories the mainstream media will never show you. If you want to hear the unfiltered truth, if you want to stay one step ahead of the headlines, then hit subscribe right now and turn on notifications. The next chapter will reveal not just how the West reacted, but how far they are willing to go to stop Africa's atomic rise, from candlelight to atomic power and the enemies it creates. The first consequence was felt not in Washington or Paris, but in the forgotten corners of Burkina Faso. In the village of Dori, Amina had lived 60 years cooking over firewood and reading by candlelight. Colonial officials promised her electricity. Independence leaders promised development. Aid agencies promised solar panels. All failed. But with the nuclear deal, she will flip a switch and for the first time see light that never fades. Her children will study under bulbs, not flames. That single bulb is not just electricity, it is the death of colonial lies. In Gawa, mechanic Sadhu dreamed of running a modern auto shop, but was trapped by a grid that delivered only 4 hours of power a day. Welding machines stood idle. Diagnostic computers sat useless. With nuclear power, his shop becomes a 24-hour operation. Dozens of young men will find work there, feeding their families, creating a ripple that transforms an entire town. At Kaya Hospital, the stakes were life and death. For years, surgeons operated by flashlight. Patients died because MRI machines failed or CT scanners shut down. Nuclear baseload power ends that nightmare. With reliable electricity, the hospital can run surgical robots, advanced labs, and intensive care units rivaling Europe. What once was a building of broken promises becomes the beating heart of West African medicine. But while citizens celebrated, political tremors shook the nation. Western corporations lost billions overnight. Stock markets in Canada and France dipped as mining giants realized their golden era in Africa was over. What they once extracted freely was now locked behind walls of African sovereignty. And that kind of economic shock always brings retaliation. Inside Burkina Faso, whispers spread. Who would dare betray Traoré for the right price? Coup rumors multiplied. Anonymous messages flooded social media. Nuclear power is too dangerous for Africans. Corruption will waste the money. The West will never allow this to succeed. These were not random doubts. They were psychological warfare, crafted in foreign offices, aimed at breaking the people's resolve before a single reactor was built. And yet, every rumor backfired. Each attack made the crowds larger. Each warning made the chants louder. No more darkness. No more dependence. Traoré's political base grew stronger, fueled by the conviction that enemies abroad were terrified of Burkina Faso's rise. But the danger is real. History shows what happens when African leaders step too far outside Western control. Lumumba, Sankara, Gaddafi, all spoke of sovereignty. All died violently. Now Traoré walks the same razor's edge, backed not only by his people, but by a nuclear project that could transform the entire continent. The consequences are not limited to light bulbs and hospitals. They reach into the deepest foundations of global power. So here's the truth. Every kilowatt of electricity that lights a home in Burkina Faso now carries a shadow. That shadow is the threat of sabotage, propaganda, and betrayal. The people have gained power, but power always attracts enemies. The question is not whether they will strike, it is when and how hard. And that is why you cannot look away. Because this story is not just about Burkina Faso. It is about whether Africa can truly break free. If you want to follow every twist, every shock the mainstream refuses to cover, hit subscribe right now. The next part will reveal how America and the world are recalculating their strategies in the face of an atomic Africa. Why Washington fears a nuclear Africa more than China. When news of the $56 billion nuclear deal broke, America did not celebrate a new dawn for Africa. Instead, the Pentagon called it a security crisis. To U.S. Official nuclear reactors in Burkina Faso are not just power plants. They are geopolitical earthquakes. Behind closed doors in Washington, analysts whispered comparisons to Libya in 2011. They remembered how Gaddafi threatened to create an independent African currency backed by gold. Within months, NATO jets were in the skies above Tripoli. Now they feared Traoré could do something even more dangerous, unleash Africa's uranium, not as raw ore for export, but as nuclear electricity fueling independence. For the United States, the timing is lethal, already stretched by confrontations with China and Russia. Washington now sees a third front, Africa rising beyond control. The fear is not warheads. Burkina Faso has no intention of building weapons. The fear is respect. Nations that master the atom demand to be heard at international tables. And if Africa demands respect, the entire architecture of Western dominance begins to crumble. Europe's reaction was more emotional. Paris was furious. Brussels panicked. For decades, the European Union lectured Africa on sustainable energy, handing out solar panels and wind turbines like crumbs. But in truth, they were ensuring Africa never gained the same tools that powered Europe's industrial rise. Nuclear was always reserved for the elite. That barrier is now shattered, and Europe cannot stop it. Elsewhere, the reactions were mixed. In Moscow, officials smiled quietly. Russia sees opportunity, new markets, new alliances, and another blow to Western monopoly. In Beijing, the calculation was different, but equally ambitious. China views a nuclear Africa as both a partner and a competitor. Partner, because Beijing can offer infrastructure, technology, and loans. Competitor, because Africa, with its own power base, no longer depends on Chinese-built coal plants or dams. Even in the Middle East, the ripples spread. Turkey expressed interest in expanding cooperation. The Gulf states, watching closely, realized that Africa could soon power not only itself, but also export electricity northward. Energy dominance, once a Western privilege, might become an African reality. But for Washington, This is about more than economics. It is about control. An Africa capable of fueling itself, exporting electricity, and training its own nuclear engineers is an Africa that does not need IMF loans, U.S. aid, or NATO security umbrellas. That terrifies policymakers, because without dependence, there is no leverage. Already, think tanks in Washington are publishing reports warning of strategic realignment. They argue that if Africa controls 60% of the world's uranium and begins using it for itself, global supply chains will shift. The U.S. will face a simple choice: treat Africa as an equal or lose influence to rivals who will. The global chessboard is changing. For 70 years, Africa was the pawn, its uranium mined, its resources stripped, its people left in darkness. With this deal, Burkina Faso threatens to turn Africa into the queen.